So before we talk about how to make things better in any given context, we need to step back and ask, what do we know and how do we know it? Through what frameworks, technologies, institutions, paradigms, worldviews, and so on, do we come to know what we think we know about cities, for example? And this matters for many reasons, not the least of which is that how we understand and talk about a problem shapes what we imagine we can do about it, right? So what we think we know is extremely germane to any actions that we might take to address an issue. Now, there are, of course, multiple ways of knowing anything and many ways of evaluating that knowledge. So in an urban context, we could point, for example, to a colonial worldview that has shaped how we understand what a city is, how it develops and grows, what it should be. We could talk about white supremacist, racist worldviews that have very much shaped the organization of cities and neighborhoods and communities. We could look at the practice or technology of cartography, right? How we map and depict cities. We could talk about the division of cities into grids and private property lines, again, as a way of knowing the city in the way that we do. Could think about site plans, right, that developers, architects, landscape architects, and so on draw up as a particular way of knowing a space or thinking that we know what a space is going to be. There are any number of ways really of seeing and producing knowledge about urban space, and they all need to be noticed, deconstructed, denaturalized, and so on. So my training in feminist theory gives me the tools to ask a set of epistemologically inclined questions about city building that also intersect with the questions of gender. So we could ask, how have women and other marginalized genders been excluded as knowers, right? As people who have legitimate knowledge to contribute to the city. How have women and others been denied epistemic authority or legitimacy, for example, through stereotypes of women as being irrational, emotional, less intelligent, et cetera, et cetera. And then how have feminized ways of knowing been denigrated? And by feminized ways of knowing, I mean those things that have been ascribed a kind of feminine quality, right? So emotional knowing, connected knowing, those sorts of things. How have women's lives, roles, and interests in the city been produced in ways that construct women as inferior, needing protection, or there to serve male interests? How have ways of knowing the city rendered women's lives, interests, bodies, and activities invisible? How have gendered power relations been ignored or downplayed in terms of their significance? How has the knowledge produced about the city been often less than useful for those in subordinated positions? And how has it reinforced hierarchies of power? So I'm not here today to attempt to answer those questions. I just put them out there as food for thought in terms of a critique of how we know the city. So in turn then, what does a feminist epistemology offer? Well, again, I don't have time to, I'm not here to give you a lecture on feminist epistemology, but very briefly, feminist ways of knowing argue for situated knowledges, as Donna Haraway called them, partial perspective, and a refutation of the God trick, the idea that there is an objective way of sort of all-knowing, all-seeing anything, including the city. Feminist epistemology defends and is invested in acknowledging different ways of knowing and not upholding a singular way of knowing something as the best. Feminist epistemology conceptualizes the value of experience, now not without critique. Experience is not something that we just hold up and reify as, ultimately better than other ways of knowing, but there is an attempt to engage with experience and subjective knowledge as legitimate forms of knowledge. And finally, a feminist epistemology values the knowledge of the oppressed with the idea that actually those who have to struggle against systems of power gain a special knowledge, right? A double consciousness of the world through which that they have to navigate, and they have to kind of understand their own world as well as the world of the oppressor just to survive day to day. So let me move on to the second framework that I think has been valuable, and that's everyday life. So one of the central feminist critiques of standard ways of knowing the city is that they focus either on abstract forces and processes like globalization or urban restructuring, or on the world of work, production, politics, in other words, the so-called public sphere. And under this framework, private spaces like the home have often been ignored, as well as the private life of the family, but even more so just the world of everyday life, by which we mean the day-to-day routines, interactions, micro experiences that kind of make up the fabric of our day-to-day. For a long time, these were not really seen to hold much value for understanding the city. Feminists and others interested in gender and women's lives challenged this, as did other like urban anthropologists and community studies scholars who started to like go into the community. Again, not without some problematic outcomes, but with the view that in order to understand something about cities, you actually have to interact with people and understand the texture of their lives. So in contrast to, a perspective that sees everyday life as too personal, too subjective, too individual, a feminist perspective believes that everyday life tells us a lot about those macro processes. So thinking about cities again, we can understand a lot about everything from housing to transportation to work to education by looking closely at how people interact with those spaces and systems on a day-to-day level. So everyday life is an important window for figuring out why, for example, a process like globalization comes to matter in people's lives. On a practical level, when it comes to the question of building and designing cities, ignoring an everyday life perspective means that you are potentially wasting a lot of time and money creating something that may not be used in the way that you want it to, or at all, or that simply doesn't work for people's lives. You need to understand some day-to-day basics, right? Which routes do kids walk or bike to school along? What corner do parents stop on to have a chat? What benches do retired folks sit on to play dominoes or listen to the radio? What corners of the park do people avoid? Where do unhoused people sit to ask for money, right? These things matter in people's lives, and developers, architects, and planners, when they inadvertently or unintentionally trample on everyday life or show no understanding of it, quite frankly, people don't like it. Okay, so my final framework that I will talk about here is that of intersectionality. So I think, for me, the third gift, if you will, of a feminist perspective is the theory of intersectionality. The inclusion of women and a more broadly gendered perspective is, of course, necessary, but it's not sufficient. After all, women are not a monolithic group. As Audre Lorde said, no one lives a single issue life. So accounting for difference is key, but intersectionality does not just mean counting up our multiple identities, especially our marginalized ones. This kind of identity counting is the rather superficial understanding of intersectionality that circulates more widely these days, but its origins from Black legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw were focused on systems intersecting, not identities. So Crenshaw was thinking about how systems of sexism, racism, and classism, and today we might add queerphobia, transphobia, ableism, and a number of others, how these interact with one another, often to reinforce the oppressions of some people located within that matrix. Crenshaw's point was that you could not disentangle, for example, sexism from racism in the lives of Black women who were, the subject of her interest and study. Racism and sexism are always working together, and you can't pull it apart and say, oh, this piece of discrimination that this Black woman faced is because of her gender, and this piece is because of her race, and we would address them separately, which was kind of how the law on harassment and discrimination worked. But Crenshaw was like, that actually doesn't get at the root of the problem. So if we take this way of thinking into an urban context, it means that we need to understand how multiple systems of power simultaneously and in mutually reinforcing ways have shaped the landscape. Like, it's not just class, right, that organizes the city, and class is not, separate from race, gender, and so on. So we have to understand the past in an intersectional way, like how did we get the cities that we have? Again, not just through one force acting, but we also have to interrogate the ideas that we have for the future through an intersectional lens. Now, we don't have a crystal ball that's going to show us exactly how things will turn out, and we can't always know that we might have kind of failed one group or another, but we can look to the insights of a range of community members to help us step outside of our own positionality and to imagine how a given idea or place or design or policy will land in the lives of different people. So to conclude then, in my own thinking, writing, and practice, I believe that my gender studies background has given me enormously useful tools, not just the three that I've talked about today, but those three kind of rose to the top. So critique of epistemology and appreciation of everyday life, and the analytic lens of intersectionality. And these are not tools that are limited to the gender studies major, but they are things that I think come through something like a humanities and arts-based education. So thank you for listening to those remarks, and I'll look forward to our conversation shortly.